Okay, so can you just first of all tell us your name and where we are?
I'm Ali Capper and I farm here at Stocks Farm, Suckley, Worcestershire with my husband Richard.
So could you just give us a bit of an idea about sort of an overview of how the industry's kind of changed over the last sort of century, really, just in terms of things like mechanisation, moving from hand picking, and and also kind of workforce and those kind of things.
So I guess if we go back to this turn of the century, 1900, though you would have seen hops growing all over the country. Every farm almost would have had a small parcel of hops. Every farm would have had hop picking going on. There were farms in southern Scotland, in northern England, all the way down the country. One of the key changes was the Second World War, and that actually introduced one of our biggest diseases. When the country dug for Britain and planted food, hops were removed, potatoes were put in, and at the end of the war, when we didn't need to dig for food to the same extent, the hops went back into the same ground, and we discovered that verticillium wilt had been introduced into that ground, and that was one main reason why we saw a decline in hop growing in this country. If we move forward then into the 50s and early 60s, when mechanisation really took hold of farming, that's when we saw the move away from hand picking every hop off the individual vine into a more mechanised system, and that involved bringing the whole plant in from the field and putting it through a machinery that plucked the leaf and hop and then separated it, so all of that became mechanised. This farm would have had hundreds of workers hand picking hops in the 50s. Today we have a team of 13 picking the same quantity of hops, so the number of people has reduced dramatically. As we go fast forward then through the latter half of last century, we would have had other changes around the use of the fuel that we used to dry the hops, and we would have gone from coal to oil, and latterly there's been a move towards gas as the fuel that's used to dry. So there's been lots and lots of changes. I think the fundamental change was that as farming specialised, hops became a crop that were grown in the 50s and 60s where there was a labour source and where there was good land. And it's no surprise that the Garden of Kent and the Garden of the West of England, which is Herefordshire and Worcestershire, are the two areas where hops were focused. And that was a guaranteed labour force from the factories in London and the factories out of the Black Country. So that's where the hand picking came from. And today, of course, our labour comes from all parts of the world. So in terms of a trot through the last century, that's hops. I could give you the equivalent of beer and what's changed in beer, which also reflects what's changed in hops, actually.
So do you want to tell me about the changes in the beer industry as well then?
So it would be fair to say that the British brewing industry is famous for brewing drinkable beer. Why did we start brewing beer in the first place? Well, because the water wasn't safe to drink. So if you go back centuries, we boiled water and we flavoured it with all sorts of things, including grain and herbs and eventually hops, to create a drink that was safe. And on farms, farm workers were often paid in that drink. And so the same too with cider. What happened in the latter half of last century was really the continental growth of lager on the continent, and that took hold not just on the continent but in America and then gradually around the world. What that led to was a globalisation of the brewing industry, and where we as a nation had been famous for India Pale Ales, best bitters, porters, stouts, lager became the drink of choice. A bland, not particularly highly hopped beer. That globalisation of the brewing industry did something else to hop farmers, and that was really hops became a commodity. Hops became something that were added as a flavour, but actually what the industry started doing was processing them, extracting the oils, and very much hops were sold as a lowest cost commodity. It's all changed since we've had the revolution that is craft brewing, which actually started, interestingly, about 30 years ago in the US as a backlash really to this predominance of lager, this fairly bland drink. Brewers like the Boston Beer Company started looking back at old continental brewing styles, old English brewing styles, and reintroducing those best bitters, porters, stouts, golden ales, pale ales, IPAs, India Pale Ale, that we used to brew here. That's all become synonymous with the craft brewing revolution, and in the last 10 years has revolutionised the brewing industry in the US and in the UK and now across Europe. We've gone in the UK from 80 odd breweries in the UK 25 years ago to today over 1,500, and in the US 6,000 to 7,000. I mean, just phenomenal growth in small brewers that care about provenance, they care about local, they care about community, they care about quality. And what we love as hop growers is that they like lots of hops in their beer. It's all about highly hopped, really well flavoured beer. So that's the sort of trot through the last century of the brewing industry.
Good times for you then.
Better times,
Yeah.
Definitely. More interesting times for the
Yeah.
beer drinker as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so the plant is a perennial plant. We, as growers, we either plant, to start off a hop yard, we plant either a cutting, or if we're doing it in the autumn, we will plant a root which overwinters and then emerges. But assuming you have an established hop yard, your plant emerges March, April, depending on when spring springs. And with the tall traditional hop yards, we spend March stringing by hand, April and into early May training. We call it hop tying, but it's training the plant clockwise, not anti-clockwise. Anti-clockwise, they fall off. And if we have a windy spring, you have to keep retraining because they get blown off and they can't find their way back up the string. And then the growing, I think phenomenal growth, the growing period, it really is from April to June. From April to June, they hit the top wire. So in the case of the tall traditional hops, they're growing 5 to 6 metres tall in 2.5, 3 months. In July, they throw out their lateral or sideways growth. And then in August, they come into burr, which is, it's like fluff. It looks like fluff. It's the precursor to the hop flower. And that's really all the brewer wants, is the hop flower. At harvest, we would have about 13 workers here who would come and help us take the whole plant out of the yard, in the case of the traditional tall hops, and take that through the machine that plucks and separates the hop and leaf and eventually then dries the hop, and the hops are baled. In the low trellis system, which we're standing amongst here, the hops grow to 2 metres tall. They self-train, and at harvest time we come through with, it's actually a modified blackcurrant picker that plucks the hop and the leaf from the structure, and that then is taken to the machine to be separated, dried and baled.
Yeah. So what do you kind of feel sort of future challenges might be, and are there kind of issues around changes to our status in the EU and that kind of thing?
Yes. Future challenges for us will be around labour supply, around how we trade. Today 40% of the British crop would be exported, mostly to America and Asia. So third country trading relationships are actually more, if not as important, as how we're going to trade with the EU. And then there's the whole question of farming regulation, which is also, most of the farming regulation sits in Europe, so that all has to be brought back. And it's not all fit for purpose. A lot of it is a bit of a compromise, because when you're trying to bring together regulation that works for 27 member states, there will always be compromise. So we don't necessarily want all of that regulation back as it stands. So there's a whole set of challenges, but fundamentally it's the uncertainty. We're over a year on from the referendum. We're another election later, and we still have no clarity on how we will be trading. What happens to EU workers who are permanently based here today? What happens to the workers that we need to bring in and out to do the seasonal jobs? And indeed, how we will be regulated. It's all still up in the air. We've got less than 2 years to go, so that's not great. But there are always opportunities. If you put all of that to one side, the opportunities for our farm and for us as hop growers are around what our brewer wants and what our beer drinker wants, and that's always going to be about new and interesting flavour. It's always going to be about something that they didn't think they wanted that we're now able to grow and produce for them. So areas that we're involved in as a farm around new varietal development, I hope we'll be able to include looking at whether we can introduce genetic SNP marker work so that we can fast forward our breeding programme and bring things to market much faster, because that's what our market wants. And I think there will be opportunities for us to improve growing systems and just to do things better and in a more environmentally friendly way. So yes, there are challenges. There are always challenges. Farmers are pretty resilient. You have to just keep focusing on the opportunities and the ways to make your business better. And I think we're quite good at that here. So I am a farmer's daughter, but not a hop farmer's daughter. But my godfather farmed hops. And I have got quite strong childhood memories of being allowed, after hop picking, to use the hop picking office at Uncle Pete's farm for we were allowed to make dens, and we were allowed to use it as an office, and we were even allowed to use the typewriter, which I have to say after hop picking was a little bit grimy. So I had all that memory. When I met Richard, one of the first things he did was take me for a walk around the farm, and it was November and we came through the hop picking machine, and I have to say the smell of hops is very powerful. It's a very sensory crop. And it does evoke memories that you don't realise are there. And suddenly all these childhood memories came flooding back. And so what was it like? I have to say one of my first questions was, is there any money in these hops? Because, you know, we've seen quite a decline in the UK of hop growing. And, you know, as with any farming crop that is treated as a commodity, that's quite hard work. So yes, there were some sort of slight question marks in my mind. That said, I wasn't going to get involved in the farm at all. I was running my own business. We got married, had children, and after Serena arrived, the bookkeeper left, and I was asked to help out just for a short period. And of course I started looking at the business, fresh pair of eyes, started asking difficult questions, was made a partner for tax purposes to start with. And I'm afraid I just got the bug, and I got the hop bug first. There's something about the hop plant. It is closely related to cannabis. That's its nearest plant relative. And I think there is something quite addictive about hops. Some writers talk about the scratch of the hops. Once you've been scratched by hops, that's it, you've been got for life. And that certainly happened to me. The more I dug into it, the more I went to meetings, the more I, particularly with the breeding programme, the more I wanted to understand about where the new varieties were coming from. And the more I started to learn about how hops were sold and marketed, the more I thought, now there's a challenge I quite like the look of. In between leaving home and marrying my farmer, my career was in marketing and advertising. So I guess I started to apply some of my old world to my new world. The two, if you like, two careers collided. And yeah, anyway, here we are.
Tell me a bit more about that scratch of the hop. That sounds interesting. What's that saying?
So if you touch the hop plant, it's very rough. So if you are ever involved in hop picking, you definitely need long sleeves and long trousers. You must never go into a hop yard to handle the crop with bare arms and legs, because you will literally get scratched. It's very sore, very itchy. So we talk about the scratch of the hop because it literally does, but there is something, it's the aromatic nature. It's a very sensory crop, and it's that sensorial part of the hop, I think, that just gets you. There's something about the smell of hops. I can't really describe it, but it's interesting that for all that we've mechanised the crop beyond all belief, for all that we have very modern growing systems, the brewer will still buy his hops on the rub and the sniff. So there's no scientific measurement. There is. Brewers can buy hops just looking at the science, but the craft brewers, the ones that really care about where the hops come from and what those flavours are and what they're going to deliver into the beer, they will choose their hop on the rub and the sniff. So it's not just us farmers that get the scratch of the hop, it's also the brewer.
What's your kind of strongest, sort of fondest memory? Or
I have got amazing memories of just playing office in the hop picking office, pretending we were secretaries, playing with the typewriter, getting covered in hop resin. I remember the touch and the smell very strongly, but also the noise. Before we were allowed to use the office, when hop picking was going full pelt, there were a couple of weeks which, if you went anywhere near the barn where it was happening, it was just so noisy, because the hop picking machine does make a lot of noise, plucking and separating hop and leaf. And actually that's still true today. The noise levels are still, it's still very dramatic operation when we're harvesting. As well as the smells that are filling the air. You've got all this noise and drama and a lot of movement, a lot of moving parts and moving machinery, and a lot of very small tractors. And that was true then and is still true today. I think the other abiding memory is going to school following hop trailers. They're little trailers, they still are today, with the hops bouncing up and down in the back on the way, because the whole idea from a hop farmer's point of view is to get them out of the field to the hop picking machine as quickly as possible so they don't deteriorate. But that means that you're following these bouncing loads, and of course the hops are bouncing off the back. And I do remember people, if they were lucky enough, if a bine fell off, people would stop their car and have the bine to take home and put up in their kitchen. So yeah, lots of memories actually from childhood, but they still happen today.
What do you see as the value in kind of us collecting these stories really and talking to people and sort of showing these photographs? What's the value really do you see in?
I think it's really important that our local community understands where hop farming sits within the importance of the local infrastructure. And I think often today farming is quite disconnected from the people who live in cities. Having lived in a city myself for 18 years, living in central London, it's really easy to be disconnected with where your food and drink comes from. So for me, this historic reference and focusing on what we do today, the bringing those two together, will hopefully help reconnect beer drinkers with not just where their hops come from today, but all of the history that comes with it. I have to say, when we welcome American visitors here, it's the history that's the most important to them. They just love our landscapes, they love the buildings, and so much of our local architecture is only here because we grew hops. All of the beautiful pointy hat hop buildings, they're all connected with hop growing and hop farming. So it's better understanding and it's better connection for me. That's the win.